Today we're looking at Diamine Amazing Amethyst. Hi, I'm Adam, and I'm an ink guy. I get inks, test them, and share the results with you. Diamine Amazing Amethyst is a violet or purple ink. Before we get to the writing samples, I'd really like to take a look at the sciencey bits. Up first is chromatography, and I agree with Vita that I've learned a lot by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. I put a line of ink down, I dunk it into water for 10 to 15 seconds, and we see here it's got this neat kind of magenta most of the way up, and then it becomes the purple. The one on the right I let dry for 10 minutes before I dunk it into the water for that 10 to 15 seconds, and we see no difference. You can't tell at all. If I didn't have them marked, I wouldn't be able to tell them, and I did them. So this has no water resistance, and this should be easy to clean. Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink is going to hold up on the page and how hard it might be to clean out of pens. I smear the ink, let it dry for 3 days before I test it. Now the highlighter performed very well. I see almost no spreading of the ink for being reactivated with the highlighter. So this, if you don't go crazy with the highlighter, could be really good. Water definitely reactivated and pulled most of that ink off the page. Now the pen flush reactivated and pulled most of it off, but it left a very light purple behind. It makes me feel like because it makes the paper pill, it might have pushed a little bit in, but this will still take it off the page. Just don't let your page soak in it for an hour. Bleach, definitely pulling it off the page. It's not holding back against bleach, it's just gonna go away. Now this is a bell curve, or a normal distribution. For the 365 inks I've tested, I found an average viscosity of 2.5. Keep in mind that 2.1 to 2.9 is the normal range for viscosity or the flow of the ink. Now Diamine Amazing Amethyst has a viscosity of 2.04. We see on the bell curve that is just outside the normal range. It is just a little bit wetter flowing than most of the inks that got tested. This bell curve is for average dry time. For the 365 inks tested, I found an average dry time of 17 seconds, with the normal being anywhere from 13 to 21 seconds. Diamine Amazing Amethyst has an average dry time of 15 seconds, well within that normal. So again, even though this is a wetter ink, its dry time is normal. That makes this a very good candidate for dry writing pens. If you like a dry pen to bring out the shading, this is a good way to go. To find my average dry time, I averaged my writing samples with the extra fine and the medium nib done on Clairefontaine, Tomoe River, and Rhodia paper. Let's take a look at the writing samples. I got this ink in sample form, and to keep consistent in writing samples, I use the Jinhao 159 with a Goulet 1.1 stub. Use an X450 with a Goulet medium nib, and a Jinhao X750 with a Goulet extra fine. Let's first look at Clairefontaine. We get no bleed, no feather. This spot that came through, it doesn't line up with anything on the front. So I think it's just a transfer spot from another piece of paper. I think the Tomoe River didn't dry as fast and I put it on top, and that's what that spot is. So we got user error, not a bleed through spot. So no bleed, no ghosting. Looking at the 1.1 writing, we have no feather, no spread, no haloing going on. Some shading, some nice shading, not heavy, but some nice shading. We have no sheen in this ink. When we go to the extra fine, we get a variation, not a huge amount of variation, but a very consistent light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, all the way across. So it's a very nice shading without being too extreme. Now it takes 9 seconds to dry on Clairefontaine with the extra fine nib. On the medium nib, it gets darker. We do experience some more of that same shading, that light and dark, light and dark. So this is fantastic for bringing out the shading. We see the same sort of shading where it's not huge, but there is the shade that you see, and it is really consistent in what happens on both the extra fine and the medium in the scrubby. And when I look at it at smudges, if I can see it, it doesn't show up on camera here, but I definitely would be able to see those lines. Come on, focus. I can see the lines underneath, so I would be able to read it. That's really what I'm looking at when I go after on that smudge. So looking at the Tomoe River, we get the start of some bleed through, which is interesting. Put it on very heavy. I let it sit there till it dry. It's just the beginning of some bleed through. Nothing major. Of course, we have ghosting. It's Tomoe River. Going to the 1.1 stub at the top, absolutely no shading whatsoever. None. On the extra fine, we get spots of shade, but the Tomoe River takes so long to dry, it lets the ink completely level out, and that's why we lose a lot of that shading. 16 seconds to dry. On a medium, no feathers, no spreads, Tomoe River. It's magic stuff. It never has problems with any of that kind of stuff. We don't get the halos. We start to see some shade difference. We see it in the top of the T versus the bottom of the. So you do occasionally get spots of shade, but not really much else. It shows in the scrub. You get almost no shading that goes on in the scrub. There's small areas, like right above my finger on the medium, we get a little bit. Right at on the extra fine, from right over here to right over here, we get a little bit. I would be able to recover this to read it, though. So that's interesting, because a lot of times the smudge on Tomoe River can't recover it. Going on the Rhodia. Again, we're getting a tiny bit, but that's a single straight line, so I'm thinking I scratched through the page. Just wind up being aggressive doing those scrubbies. But other than that, there's no bleeding, there's no ghosting. On the 1.1 stub at the top, we have no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen. Some shading does occur. As before, it's not getting a lot of shading, but it does show some of the color variation that this ink can give us. Onto the extra fine. We get a little bit more of the shade. We have no feathers. We have no spread. We have no halos. We have no sheen. Sheen is not something this ink is going to do for us. 11 seconds to dry. On a medium nib, we get a little bit more of the shading, and it's darker in spots, which you put down more ink, you expect it to be a little bit darker. 15 seconds to dry. Looking at the scrubbies, almost no shade shows up in the medium, although we did get a little in the right. Like if you look at that cue, it gets nice and dark, light, up to dark again. On the smudge, I could definitely read this and recover it, so I would be very willing to see this combination. We move on to the white lines paper. Definite bleeding. Although it did not bleed onto the page underneath, it is definitely bleeding through, even in the extra fine. Looking at the 1.1, we have feathers. We have feathers occurring. There we go. You can see it all over the Diamine, all over the Amazing, just at the end of the Amethyst. So we do get feathering on the 1.1 stub. It could be that it's just putting down a lot of ink there. Because on the fine, or on the extra fine, we have no feathers. We have no spread, no halos, no sheen, no shading, faster or more absorbent paper, only 1 second to dry. It sucked this ink straight in. So this was almost instant. When we go to the medium nib, we get 2 seconds to dry, so still very fast. The ink is definitely darker when we're looking at it. No shading, no feather, no spread, no halo, no sheen, nothing. Nice color, 2 seconds to dry. We look at the scrub. Again, it just absorbs in so fast. This paper's sucking that ink right in, so we don't have an opportunity to show shade. And it's easy to recover. If you were to smear it, you have to move real fast. So then I've got this P. Berger. This is a French rule paper, the P. Berger, and it's used for school children, and I had picked up some to go ahead and give it a shot, and it definitely bleeds through all over the place. It's a massacre. So ghosting doesn't even matter when you're bleeding through all the time, but it didn't hit the page underneath, so it's got that going for it. When we're looking at the 1.1 stub, a ton of feathering, definite spread. Definitely spreading. It's getting thicker. Okay, when we compare it to the Rhody, we see it's definitely getting thicker on what's going on. It makes it a little harder to write when it's doing something like that, but not good for the 1.1 stub. In the extra fine, I don't see any feather. I don't see much spread. There's a little bit of spread, but it's not the biggest in the world. But there is a little bit of spread. It looks like a fine opposed to an extra fine. No shade, no halo, no sheen, none of that. 1 second to dry. Medium nib gives us feathering again. So when we get to that more ink, oh, I'm sorry, the extra fine did give a little bit of feathering. But the only spot I see it occur, come on camera, the only spot I see it occur is at the camera. You're going to fight with me for no reason. There we go. On the one. On the one, I have feathering. It's the only spot of the extra fine where I see the feathering occur. But while we're close, we can see it in a bunch of places on the medium. That Q. The Q of Quick has quite a bit of feathering down near the bottom on the outside. We get a bunch of that tiny feathering all over the place on the medium nib. It does spread some, as the extra fine did. No halo, no shade, no sheen, none of that stuff. 3 seconds to dry. Because it's absorbing so fast, when we look at a scrubby, we get no color variation, so we can't expect to ever get any. And when we look at the lines to see when we smudge if we keep it, we would keep it. It absorbs in automatically. This paper's like a sponge. But if you're using it for practicing writing, as long as you're not destroying the page underneath, this would work perfectly fine. Instead of finding inks that look like Diamine Amazing Amethyst, I would prefer to find an ink that will complement its color on the page. I've chosen Private Reserve Claret because of its very nice magenta color. I feel that this really helps one pop against the other and not either being incredibly overbearing. Before I give my opinion on this ink, I'm asking if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and if it's your first time here, I'd invite you to subscribe. To make sure I have a range of experience with this ink, I do the writing samples. I then put the ink in a different pen and use it for a day. I also then put it into another pen to take my notes. My notes today were taken with a Levenger True Writer with a broad nib. So what do I think about Diamine's Amazing Amethyst? I think this is a great color. I think it lacks some of the inky properties that sometimes people go looking for, but it's still pretty to look at. Would I buy a bottle of this ink? For me, no. But that's because I really like shading, and there are purple inks that have tremendous shading that I would rather have. Thanks for watching.